So I got a call from my city editor, Muteginjao. It was around 5 p.m. telling me to be on standby because the information that Ouko is missing.
And we were told there is a hard boy who saw the body of Ouko, that Ouko's body has been found somewhere near Gotalela.
The charred remains of the late Ouko were still smoldering. So I stood there in a daze.
Iliungua tu lakini imebambuka sasa. Lakini sura yake ilikuwa inaweza kuonekana kwamba ako ni yeye mwenyewe.
With public pressure mounting on the government to bring to book those behind the minister's murder, the government caved in and invited the Scotland Yard detectives from London. Casefiles traveled 10,000 kilometers to Cornwall, southwest of the United Kingdom, to speak to this man who got the first call from his superiors.
The murder squad at Scotland Yard, you had several senior officers, of which I was one, on call to deal with any murder investigation or serious investigations anywhere in the world if called upon for assistance. And those officers were very experienced officers in murder investigations. And we had what they called a frame, which you had a detective superintendent and a detective inspector on 1 hour standby to go anywhere. Number 2 was the detective superintendent and a detective inspector on an 8-hour standby. And number 3 was the same, but on a 48-hour standby. So while you're in the frame, you have your bags packed ready. You go home, but you have to go home. So when I got the call for this, I was number 1 in the frame. I was called up to see one of the assistant commissioners and said, we've had a request from the Kenyan government for assistance on the death of the foreign minister, Dr. Ouko. And you're going, because you're number 1 in the frame. So I had bags ready, and I then went over to the Foreign Office and got briefed. And then the arrangements, and then I picked my team, including Ian West, the forensic pathologist and a forensic officer, and we flew out the next day.
John Troon was the lead detective, and his team was Dr. Ian West, a renowned pathologist, and 2 other police officers. At the time, the team was simply told the Kenyan government wanted to know the circumstances behind the minister's demise.
The first man I was met by was Johan Anguka, and there was several others, including the director of your medical centre and other government ministers, particularly from the Foreign Office. But Anguka made it clear to me that he was the person that was in charge, and that he would be the person that would be liaising with us for the duration that we were going to be there. And I queried that because normal protocol would say you would have police officers meeting you, police officer to police officer, but I didn't see the commissioner until the following day, which I felt was unusual.
John Anguka was the Nakuru District Commissioner and a close friend of the fallen Foreign Affairs Minister. Troon and his team kicked off the investigation 8 days after the minister's body was discovered.
That afternoon, Dr. West and I did second post-mortem on Dr. Ouko. And as a result of that, it was obvious to both of us that Dr. Ouko was murdered. Because Ian West had found forensic evidence to suggest the fact. And that evening we had a meeting with Oyugi, Anguka, and several others from the Kenyan Foreign Office. There was about 15 or 20 of them, including the Commissioner Kalenzo at that stage. And they wanted to know what our first impressions was in relation to the death of Dr. Ouko. And we made it clear to those people that Dr. Ouko was murdered.
Troon and his team had been informed by their country's embassy in Nairobi that the minister had been killed, but the government of the day was pursuing suicide as the possible reason of the minister's death.
They wouldn't accept that. They said, Yugi said to me, Mr. Troon, Dr. Ouko wasn't murdered, he committed suicide. And we said, no, the evidence suggests he was murdered. And we stuck to our guns on that, and of course then we drifted away back to the hotel, and I was left there for a while with no terms of reference or anything like that. And I saw Colenso a day or so later and said, look, I need, what do you want me to do? Because if you want us to investigate this, or I help you to investigate it, we'll investigate the murder investigation. No, he said, it's a suicide. Well, I said, well, if you don't give me any terms of reference, I shall be leaving the country within the next 48 hours and going back to England. And of course, then they suddenly realised if I left, the riots would probably commence again.
Ezekiel Yugi was the Internal Security Permanent Secretary. Philip Kilonzo was the police commissioner. Earlier, the government had been uncommittal about the minister's actual cause of death. For 2 days, the country had been gripped with fear. If a cabinet minister would be killed and his body disposed of in the wild, who was safe?
The fire that burned the eminent minister to the bone burned only a small portion of grass below his trunk. This is after describing the weather and the vegetation. Because in those days you could not say in your story that you believe that with all facts standing as they were, this man was killed elsewhere and the body transferred to the scene. You couldn't say that. That would be suicidal for both you and the media house you are representing.
Before the minister would be laid to rest, the chief government pathologist Jason Dakaini Kaviti, in a prepared autopsy report made public much later, claimed that the minister traveled for 7 kilometers, neatly arranged his personal belongings, shot himself in the head and stomach, and then he set his body on fire. The minister later lay on his back and died. On the 24th of February 1990, 10 days after the minister's grisly murder, Robert Ouko was laid to rest at an emotional and politically charged ceremony at his Koru home, ironically just 7 kilometers away from where his body had been discovered.
There were GSUs and APs and police officers in almost every stretch of the road, from Kisumu to Mahoroni to Ouko's home. You could actually see the red berets lying down the sugar plantations. Then of course Moi came with his cabinet. The crowds were very hostile. The person who cooled down the crowds was actually Mrs. Christabel Ouko. She told them that my husband loved peace, so please let's bury him in peace. But the students were shouting that you killed Ouko, you burnt Ouko, now eat him. Well, the shouts were coming from mainly students from various universities. But the tension was, you could actually feel it, you could touch it.
The next moment we saw was circles of security guys up to the plantation. They all came up, and the place just went dead quiet for some time.
Heavy government presence, including those later arrested and linked to his murder, attended the funeral.
Women were raped, girls were raped, people were maimed. With cases that were covering in places like Kondele and Migosi and Obunga, parts of Kisumu, where girls were raped and thrown into pots of boiling porridge or water. So I would go to Nyanza Hospital and look at the injured. They were horrifying scenes. I recall one senior doctor. I will not give his name because I'm not authorized. I mean, I haven't sought his permission. But I remember him shouting commands that if any police officer comes here with any wounds, amputate them. I think he spoke out of anger because he saw what they had done to Wananchi in the name of quelling violence. He thought probably the only way to help to hit out the forces was any officer coming with a small wound, amputate.
Top government officials promised that no stone would be left unturned until those behind the minister's murder were brought to book.
Ouko was basically a very innocent man. Innocent in the sense that he was not a politician. Ouko was just a good, brilliant fellow, a great foreign affairs minister, a great diplomat, not a politician. If he was a politician, actually Ouko might be alive today. If he was a true politician, he would have shouted wolf and his life would have been spared. But he sat there believing that the people he served diligently could not hurt him.
With that, Robert Ouko's remains remained behind, 6 feet under, in a section of his expansive home in Muhoroni. The government set up parallel investigations as the Scotland Yard detectives dug into the minister's murder. All the witnesses John Troon called in for questioning were trailed and questioned by the Dead Special Branch Unit, now renamed the National Intelligence Service. Robert Ouko's death did not end with him in the grave. It opened a new chapter in high-level cover-up, murders and controversial theories. Next week on Case Files, we dig into the lead investigators John Troon's police diary, and we bring you the shocking details from Koru. Denison Sarigo for Case Files.